Thank you for joining us on this week's show. We are delighted that you could join us again for this episode. And we have actually invited David Weatherly back onto the show today, talking about his book, Strange Intruders. This is another great book from David. And welcome to the show again, David.
Thanks, Tracie. It's a pleasure to be back.
Well, thank you. It's great to have you back with us here in our Las Vegas studio. And in honor of the show we did with the Black Eyed Kids, we decided to keep a couple of our panels up here with the Black Eyed Kids looking directly at us.
I noticed that. Yeah. It gives us a nice creepy atmosphere, right?
Creepy atmosphere indeed. So David, for as long as man has been created, there's always been tales of strange beings, as you know, accounts of alien beings and many encounters with the paranormal. Let's talk about one of these beings in particular today, the shadow people. Shadow people have always been one of those things talked about in the paranormal world. How far back in history can we go when we talk about these particular beings?
Really, Tracie, we can go all the way through history, you know, age upon age, and we find accounts of these shadow beings. An example is during the medieval period, we had accounts of what were called phantom monks, or shadow monks. These images of these hooded figures that were solid black, wandering around the grounds of haunted castles and monasteries and so forth. But even further back in history we find consistently this phenomena reported, and in fact today it is considered the most widely reported type of paranormal phenomena.
Right, and in your book you mentioned that in 2010 shadow people were listed as one of the most regularly reported types of paranormal phenomena in the US.
Exactly.
Why is this case, do you think?
You know, we're not sure. I mean, it's just something that consistently shows up at particularly haunted locations, but also in people's homes. You know, these things are so widely reported around the world at this point, and they have a very disturbing air about them. You know, people report seeing these things standing over their beds or darting around their rooms or their homes, and we simply have no explanation to, help these people understand exactly what these beings are. There are a lot of theories, but something very unsettling is happening.
A shadow person, also known as a shadow figure, shadow being, or black mass, is the perception of a patch of shadow as a living, humanoid figure, particularly as interpreted by believers in the paranormal, or supernatural, as the presence of a spirit, or other entity. Those who are experiencing and studying the shadow people phenomenon say that these entities appear as dark forms in the peripheries of people's vision, and disintegrate, or move between walls, when noticed. Reports of shadow people are similar to ghost sightings, but differ in that shadow people are not reported as having human features, wearing modern or period clothing, or attempting to communicate. Witnesses also do not report the same feelings of being in the presence of something that was once human. Some individuals have described being menaced, chased, or attacked by shadow people. There have also been reports of shadow people appearing in front of witnesses, or lingering for several seconds before disappearing.
Well, I was going to ask you, in your research of strange intruders and particularly of shadow people, what are you finding in your research? Are you finding that these are demonic, or do you think they're possibly spirits that have not been able to cross over peacefully, maybe?
You know, again, we're looking at a phenomena with a lot of different potential explanations. As you and I talked about when we discussed the black-eyed children, there are a lot of aspects of the shadow people that seem to branch over into different types of phenomena. Some people believe they're demonic. I personally sort of go towards the interdimensional entity theory once again with these things, because we have situations where they show up and they vanish just as quickly as they appear. You know, people will report seeing them run into a closet, and of course they'll open the closet door and there's nothing there. But these figures more often than not seem to be observing, as if they're collecting data or something on the people that they're watching. It's really kind of unnerving.
That is very, very strange. And as the name implies, shadow people, obviously, they're in human form.
Most often, although there are some accounts that describe them otherwise. We have accounts of these sort of almost blob-like figures that move apparently under some conscious direction, but mainly the accounts are that these are humanoid figures. Sometimes they appear to be wearing a hat. One of the famous accounts is something called the Hat Man, and people report this shadow being wearing what appears to be a fedora. But most of the accounts, it seems to be a humanoid form that is average adult size, and it will appear blacker than black is how people often describe it. Blacker than the shadows that we're used to. People will tell me about seeing these things in a darkened room, but they're seeing a black figure. I mean, that's kind of hard to wrap your head around in a sense.
It's hard to
but they're
grasp.
saying that the darkness of this shape, this humanoid shape, is blacker than the darkness in their room, so they can distinguish the movement and its direction.
Now, unlike the black-eyed children we spoke about in last week's show, who have to be invited into the home, shadow people are already in the home. They just show up.
They appear to have no boundaries. They can show up anywhere, anytime. And of course, that is one of the disturbing aspects. As I related a moment ago, people see these things darting into a closet, and they open the closet and the figure's not there.
Right.
It's as if there's some kind of extra doorway or portal perhaps in there.
Is there any particular room in a home that these shadow people tend to linger?
Most often they're reported in bedrooms. Now, some people of a more scientific and sometimes skeptical nature will say that this is linked to different types of sleep phenomena, whether it's sleep paralysis or whatever, where people are hallucinating. But, I have account upon account of people who were fully conscious and encountered these things. Again, most frequently it seems to be in the bedroom.
And are these reports of shadow people physically touching people, do we know?
That's where it gets really bothersome, because in recent years there have started to be some reports of people having physical encounters with these entities. Initially, some of the reports I had were that they were experiencing poltergeist-like phenomena around their home while they were seeing the shadow people or in conjunction with those sightings. And on a few occasions, at least that I'm aware of, these encounters have escalated to the point that there has been some physical contact from these shadow beings.
And interestingly enough, David, when I wrote my book, Welcome to Haunted Las Vegas, Nevada, I sat with a paranormal investigations team out here in Las Vegas, which is Las Vegas Society of Supernatural Investigations. And one of the cases that they gave to me to put in the book was based in a cemetery, that they, as the investigations team, would often see shadow people hiding behind bushes, trees, and just generally around the cemetery perimeter. This seems to be a typical hangout place also for these shadow people, right?
It certainly seems to be one of the locations where we get a lot of these reports. But again, haunted locations in general, there seem to be constant accounts of these shadow people. And in fact, often the more notorious the haunted site, the more likely there are to be encounters with shadow people. So, some of the famous locations like Waverly Hills, Sanitarium, places like that, we find these encounters with these shadow beings. And that has led a lot of people to believe that they are essentially some type of trapped spirit, perhaps, of a negative nature that is taking that form in order to harass people.
And I was going to ask you, do you feel it's more malevolent than benevolent?
Well, certainly from the accounts that we have, they tend to be much more on the creepy side. And on a few occasions, they seem to be outright malicious entities, whatever they are. But very often what we get is just that sort of creepy observance of human life, and it makes you question exactly what they're there for. But, you know, that makes people very uncomfortable.
Right, exactly. And also encountering a shadow person in the home, some of the people talk about the fact that they feel frozen, that they can't move, which is leading, you know, science to believe that this is nothing more than sleep paralysis. But that's not the case, is it?
No, I don't think it is. You know, there's far too many of these cases where the people are fully awake and conscious
Fully
or walking
awake.
around their home. There's a lot of accounts where people have, yes, they've walked into their room, you know, they've sat down on their bed and suddenly they see this figure. A lot of times this seems to be simply a case of just stark fear that paralyzes the person, you know, because how do you react when you're not used to dealing with this type of phenomena and suddenly you see something that appears human but isn't? You know, it's a shadow. It plays a lot of tricks with the mind. You know, a lot of people have said to me that they saw the shadow and their first thought was, my God, there's an intruder in my house. Where is he? What's causing the shadow? But there is nothing causing the shadow. The shadow is the intruder.
Right. And I found it interesting, David, to read that in one of the cases you mention in Strange Intruders, is that a person started to experience shadow people when they stopped attending church on a regular basis.
That was one of the physical encounters that I talked about. This gentleman, you know, he was very dedicated to his job, and he said that he got so focused on his career that he stopped going to church. And he really believes that the encounters that happened in his home were a direct result of falling off of his spiritual path. You know, that's his opinion, and that's what worked for him, obviously, because he went back to church after this encounter. But his dealing with the shadow person became very serious. He started experiencing poltergeist-like activity in his home, and it escalated to a point where he was regularly seeing this shadow form moving about his home. He came home one evening. It had been a long day at work. He checked his mail, did a couple of things. He went to get prepared for bed, and literally something reached out from under his bed and grabbed him by the ankles. Now, this is almost a classic boogeyman story. You know, it's just so disturbing because suddenly this gentleman has something physically grabbing him, and he said that he looked down and saw what appeared to be hands, but they were solid black, as you know, as black as night. And this figure, whatever it was, yanked him by the ankles. It knocked him to the floor. He glanced under the bed and saw a pair of glowing eyes within the head of this figure. And whatever it was trying to drag him under the bed. He ended up wrapping his hands around an old-fashioned radiator and, you know, was in a stark panic trying to figure out what to do initially. Eventually he started praying. He grabbed a Bible, and this seemed to repel whatever this was. So again, it's a case of where someone went back to their faith and stopped experiencing the phenomena that they had in their homes.
Interesting. So how many cases have you heard of, David, where this kind of thing has happened or where they've been physically attacked?
Well, that's a very extreme case, and I've only heard of a handful of those. That was probably the most notable one when I did the Strange Intruders book. But there are some other cases here and there where people will report these shadow figures tossing an object sometimes, or doing physical things in the home like opening a bedroom door or a window and things like that. As I said, this is a pretty extreme case, and I don't think I've heard anything this severe before.
The Tracie Austin Show would like to thank our sponsor, Zohar Stargate TV. And for more information about our sponsor, please visit zoharstargate.com. And they can appear for a certain amount of time, and then they might not be seen for a while.
This is correct. People will report a series of encounters with the shadow people, and suddenly they're just gone. But then, you know, months or sometimes a year or two later, the things start to manifest again.
And as in the case of Laurie that you mention in your book, who says that she's never had a normal life because the shadow people are always with her.
That's right. There are some people that report that they have seen these entities from the time they were children, and they've been virtually plagued with them. They can't understand what they are. Now, for those people, nothing seems to work. I've talked to some of those, who have had long-time encounters with the shadow people, and they have literally tried multiple types of religious approaches, scientific approaches. One woman I spoke with went through a whole series of studies to determine whether she had some kind of sleep paralysis condition or something like that. They found nothing. So there was nothing literally to explain why this woman was having these encounters, nor could she find an answer to ending the encounters. So she continues to deal with it, and they are very sporadic. Sometimes there will be several of them within a week, and then she'll go for months and not see the things. But she has moved multiple times and still has the encounter. So it's not tied to the location, it's tied to her.
So it's very interesting then to try and understand how these shadow people find their victims, if I can call them victims. How? I mean, why do they just tend to show up? What is attracting them?
That's a great question. I wish I had a great answer. Again, there's little consistency in how these things show up and how often and why. As we see in some of these cases, it seems to be the person itself that the phenomena is centered around. But then we can sort of look at the other side of the coin and play devil's advocate and say, well, no, sometimes these entities are connected to a particular location, because there are haunted locations that have consistent reports of shadow figures from multiple witnesses.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that dabbling with the occult and magical practices can conjure up these things?
There are some cases that indicate that, yes.
Yes.
But we're looking at, again, I think an alternate theory to explain what these are. And some people have reported that they have attempted different types of ritual to contact earth spirits or different entities, and they have experienced shadow people in their homes as a result of doing that.
Mm-hmm. Has anyone, do you know, ever captured any EVPs of shadow people talking? Or
there are some cases where people capture EVPs in conjunction with shadow people or shadow person phenomena, but we can't say for sure that it is that particular entity that is causing the EVP. That's, there's no facial feature to see, so
right,
we don't even
right.
know whether these things are speaking or not.
Right.
And if it's in a haunted location, then there's other phenomena present anyway. So again, we have multiple layers of things going on in some of these locations.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And, in your book, you also write about another strange intruder, the Grinning Man. Let's talk about him for a while. You've actually seen the Grinning Man personally.
I have indeed.
and you mention in your book that it almost sounds like, it's a silly statement, the image of a man with a large grin, looking a bit goofy, but the Grinning Man you saw was not the guy with a simple smile on his face, but a very strange character that was totally out of place and disturbing. Give us a short version of your encounter then, David.
Sure, it was a very strange encounter. It was back in the 1980s, and I had already been involved in this type of research for many years. I was with a friend of mine. Sometimes the right combination of people itself creates experiences or phenomena, I believe, anyway. And this particular person, it seemed that whenever we went out and kind of probed into things, it would create interesting circumstances. So the fellow's name was Tom. He was actually driving one day. We were on a very remote road. It led along a canal bank. And as we were driving along, it was a nice, beautiful day. Ahead on the road, on the passenger side, I saw a figure. And this was not an area where you saw people walking around. It just wasn't. We had driven the route many, many times. I started to focus on this, wondering what the heck is why is someone standing out here? As we got closer, the figure started to come into focus. And it was one of the most bizarre things I'd ever seen, Tracie. Old-fashioned long coat, a top hat, and one hand up under his chin, sort of rubbing his fingers together. You could see a bright, shiny belt beneath the coat, and the weirdest grin I'd ever seen in my life. I remember at the time thinking, this looks like a grin the Joker in the comic books would have. You know, it was so exaggerated and extreme. It's not physically possible for someone to grin that much because the smile just kept going. And it was the creepiest effect. As we approached this figure, something else very strange happened. Time sort of seemed to slow down, if you will, so that we almost drifted past this character. And I'm looking out the passenger window trying to take in every detail that I can. As soon as we were beyond him, I turned my head around to look out the rear window of the vehicle, and he is suddenly in the center of the road. It was as if he had teleported. There's no way he could have physically moved, you know, without me seeing at least part of the movement. So now he's standing in the very center of the road watching our car in the same fashion. And suddenly time starts to move normally again. And of course, being an inquisitive type, I immediately started telling Tom, the driver, to stop, turn around. And you know, this sort of debate ensued because Tom was insistent that this is just some crazy psycho guy. And I'm like, no, I want to see this. I finally convinced him to hit a U-turn and go back. He went back part way. He said, I'm only going part way to see if the guy's still there. Well, he drove part way there, stopped the car, and I jumped out, which kind of made him go a little bit crazy. But, you know, went to the location where this guy had been standing, looked for evidence. There was just nothing there. And we're talking about a steep ditch behind the area where he was standing, you know, a heavily wooded area. A person, particularly in that type of getup, could not have easily gotten away from that scene. So he had just disappeared.
Carl, are you listening?
Yeah, I'm here. Sorry, some jerk was riding my tail all the way home, and I can't remember where they turned off.
Spooky. Where'd your aunt go, anyway?
I don't know, some last-minute trip. She said she wanted to get out of the house.
Well, you could come over to my place and have a little wine. Watch
Hello?
TV.
Laura?
Yeah. Carl? Hello?
Hello?
So, David, do you know of any international cases of this grinning man character?
Well, there are some really intriguing cases, of course, from here in the United States, but there are a few international ones. A fascinating one from Italy from the 1970s. There's one from Australia, a couple from Canada. But it's not as widespread as much other phenomena is.
David, for people who are interested in reading your book of Strange Intruders, where can they get a copy from?
Strange Intruders is on Amazon, of course, and you can go to my website, twocrowsparanormal.blogspot.com. There are hot links there for all of my books.
Wonderful. And if you have had an encounter with a shadow person or the grinning man character, we would love to hear from you. You can write to me at my website, The Tracie Austin Show. And until next time, do keep an open heart and an open mind, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye. The Tracie Austin Show would like to thank our sponsor, Zohar Stargate TV. And for more information about our sponsor, please visit zoharstargate.com.